I'm Jane.
I'm Emma Hilton. I'm a developmental biologist at the University of Manchester, and I talk a lot about sex and sport.
And I'm Bex,
And this is.
Insightful Sisters.
Hi, Emma. We're so excited to have you with us tonight. I have interviewed you once before at Virago, and I think it was on the night that Emaine Khalif won the gold. And we put together a fabulous photograph of a lot of women, angry women, with making the XX sign, which was it was quite a moment to be together. So we were really pleased when you said you'd come on and do this with us. So yeah, a developmental biologist, loads and loads of articles, over 20 reviewed publications, and a record number of citations. Is that right?
Yes, so as a developmental biologist, I'm trying to generally understand how bodies grow, and thinking about what that means in sport has been very intellectually challenging, very interesting. And yes, lots of need to get science, to get evidence out there to the public, to think about various issues about eligibility in the female category. What does it mean if you have, for example, a medical condition that affects, how you look, what your sex is recorded as, how that works with trans athletes, what that means for eligibility there. So it's been quite interesting to take a developmental biology lens into a space where people have traditionally, sports scientists, I love them all, but they really like their metrics, they really like their numbers. How fast can someone run? And a developmental biologist comes in and says, well, why can they run that fast?
Oh, that's a really interesting distinction. I one of my subjects is history, and I feel like there's a bit of a synergy between the way a historian sees study and the way a biologist does, in that for a historian, there are certain facts that everybody agrees because they're so simple and so basic. So the best example would be dates. And I feel it's the same, really, I imagine, in the science world. There are some things that you do argue about, and there are some things that you just don't bother because they're so obvious, aren't they? And that brings me nicely to Project Netty. So tell us a bit about Project Netty.
Yeah, so Project Netty was something that I started several years ago now, which was riffing on an old argument that I used to be engaged in the internet about, which was creationism. So, creationism versus evolution. And people, not so much now, at least not in the circles I run with, argue too much about this. But 20 or 30 years ago, there were huge clashes between, dinosaurs and young Earth theory. And there was a very famous evolutionary biologist, he's since died, called Stephen Jay Gould, who was this kind of figurehead for the evolution side, which is obviously scientific truth. And and there was a big list started of people that agreed with Stephen Jay Gould, basically people who understood scientific evidence regarding evolution. And they called it Project Steve, because it's a nod to him. And so I thought it was quite sweet to think about this idea of a biologist with a really clear idea about scientific evidence talking about evolution, and to see how much I could translate into scientists talking about the truth about sex. What's been interesting about Project Nettie, and that was named after Nettie Stevens, who was the woman who first discovered sex chromosomes in a type of beetle. What's been interesting about that is people have been much more keen to support evolution rather than just simple truths, as you say, about the nature of sex, the fact that
Wow.
there are males and females. Nettie
Yeah.
Stevens discovered sperm that contained a small chromosome and sperm that contained a big chromosome. And these, the offspring from these sperm were either male or female. And she rightfully understood that the small chromosome was the thing that made male offspring. But scientists don't feel the need to state this. It's always been a fairly obvious fact around my workplace when I say, can you give me a citation for what male and female mean? And people look at me like I'm insane.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
not even in textbooks. It's
No.
like asking, is water wet? Show me a citation. It's like, come on, people, right? It's all so basic.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I love the idea. And so I imagine the Beatles comes from Nettie as well, does it?
Fond of Beatles, which is my
Yes.
Twitter handle, it's a partial quote from another evolutionary biologist, a geneticist as well, called JBS Haldane, who talked about gods and creationism. And one of his arguments against creationism was that if God existed, he must be inordinately fond of beetles. And the motivation for that is there are so many beetle species in the world.
Amazing.
You can imagine a creator just having their little favorite species to knock out. And it's
He
like,
was a collector.
I've done a human. Let me just do a few beetles to get rid of the stress of doing a human.
Oh, wonderful.
So that kind of linked in, Beatles and creationism, which was my argument against it. And then
Yeah, right. I'm going to pass across to Bex. I think she's got some questions that will lead on nicely from this.
Yeah, do you know what's interesting there? I'd never really considered the similarities between the creationist arguments from 20 years ago and the arguments that we're seeing now. I remember being at school during that time, and there were genuine debates going on about whether people should be allowed to, write a note to excuse their children from classes about evolution. And we had creationists in my school that really argued about, well, how come apes still exist then, sir? So that was fascinating. It's funny how it seems each generation has its own sort of anti-science movement.
So I spoke some years ago about the absolute parallels between the creationism evolution argument and what we're seeing now, the gender identity ideology versus what I think is scientific reality. And they use the same tactics. Maybe we're not going to talk about this so much here, but inventing jargon, inventing arguments that just go on, and what we call now sea lining. But years ago, it used to be, these are propaganda terms. Capturing journals. Creationists just made new journals to publish their pseudo-scientific findings in. And what we're seeing now is something very parallel. We see Gish Gallops. I was involved in one today on Twitter. It's just someone doing what creationists used to do years and years ago, which is blinding people with these faintly scientific sounding terms. But really, when you try and dig down, they just switch to another topic and then you're exhausted. And on Twitter, then you just start calling them names and leave.
And I mean, that mention of faintly scientific sounding terms seems like the perfect time to ask you about the term intersex and what it means.
So intersex, and I'm putting, audio quote marks around that. Intersex is a term that used to describe people who didn't have typical male or typical female development. Now, humans are a class of being, a species who are in healthy state. And by that, I don't mean people are necessarily unhealthy. I'm just talking about the natural history and evolution of a species. People are either male or female, but some people who are male aren't typical males. They're infertile, or maybe they have developmental issues, defects, congenital disorders. And people who are female also have that same suite of issues. Rarely, but it does happen. So to think about people with this group of medical conditions, there's this umbrella term, intersex, and inter literally means like in the middle, right? So intersex meant something between female and male. And that's really, really derogatory. That's a male who is infertile is not somehow more female. And a female who is flat chested or who is a bit muscly is not somehow more male. Females with higher testosterone than normal are not a little bit male. So intersex, somewhere in between male and female, doesn't really capture the biology that we're talking about. And also it's really, really stigmatizing. So some years ago, maybe 30 years ago, a group of endocrinologists, geneticists, medical types got together and said, can we stop using intersex? It's a really awful description. And started to actually, in a very scientific way, categorize the different medical conditions that are, under discussion. How do we understand these biologies in a way that doesn't stigmatize patients? So now we have moved to a term that is, as I would use it, disorders of sex development. I do understand when you're talking with patients that have some of these developmental anomalies, that words like difference of sex development are softer and perhaps more empathetic. But ultimately, we're talking about medical conditions where males or females don't develop typically. This is not bigoted, it's not weird, it's not odd to say. We talk about medical conditions all the time. We have to be real and tell the truth about what these conditions involve.
And just to be absolutely clear, that does not negate the existence of sex. It's not some counter argument.
People with disorders of sex development have taught us, and I don't mean to sound paternalistic or patronizing or whatever. People with these disorders have taught us so much about how males and females do develop. What happens when you have a gene change, a mutation, a difference in sequence that means you can't produce a protein or you can't process a hormone correctly, healthily, typically, whatever, language we use about that. They teach us what male and female really look like. That's nothing to do with understanding people with conditions that aren't developing healthily. So they are fundamentally part of this whole binary. We wouldn't know what the binary looked like without understanding people who deviate in some way. And we have full empathy for those people and sensitivity. But scientifically, we wouldn't understand how sex develops without people with DSDs.
And how do we know what is a DSD and what wouldn't be considered a DSD? I'm thinking in particular, often, trans rights activists will sort of latch on to intersex arguments. PCOS, women with PCOS or elevated testosterone are often, cited as an example of a sex spectrum. How do we know that that's not the case?
The existence of disorders of sex development is a linchpin for gender identity ideology. I spent a long time trying to trace back the arguments of where this all started. I've written an academic textbook chapter where, I was sitting there with Post-it notes all over my kitchen table of this person said X, the X and Y. We use that as just examples, but X and Y in this context, it doesn't mean chromosomes, it just means examples. So this person said X, this person said Y, this person said A, B, C, or D. And I was looking at this massive web of DSDs and gender identity and what's going on here. And what it all came down to, the single anchor point, is that if you can hijack, and I don't use that term lightly, but it is what's happened, if you can hijack people with medical conditions surrounding sex development, then you can say that sex ultimately is anything you want it to be. And so these are a group of people with medical conditions who have been hijacked, right? They have been used, they have been weaponized, and they are still being used and weaponized. And we're seeing it in sports, we're seeing it in, or really all kinds of ugly contexts now. So when you start to think about DSDs indicating that sex really is just some kind of arbitrary category, and we're all just this random mix of chromosomes and ovaries or testes or penises or vulvas or testosterone or estrogen, where you end up is in a really awful place where women, female people, I'm talking about, the old fashioned kind of women who have ovarian issues, something like PCOS, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, who happen to have slightly elevated testosterone, not male level testosterone, just slightly elevated above average female. They're just on the tail end of high. They're not, male level, which is 20 times higher. You start to have to bring in those because right now, sex doesn't mean anything, right? If you've got slightly higher testosterone, you might be a bit of a man. And now we're bringing in women with PCOS. Like, that's not intersex or a disorder of sex development. That's a woman whose ovaries need a bit of like looking after. This is insane. This is honestly insane. But this is the baseline that it has to come back to. The minute you think about or try to suggest that it's all just hormones or it's all just chromosomes or you're just going to come back to men who have low testosterone are actually women and women who have high testosterone are actually men. And it's a really boringly facile scientific analysis. But then I talk to lots of people on Twitter who have boringly facile scientific analyses all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Women with PCOS are women with an ovarian disorder and metabolic disorder. They're
Absolutely. Not... And something that only a woman can experience, in entirety, it is a female condition. I'm going to pass back to Jane, who's going to dig a bit deeper into the DSD discourse with you.
I'm listening and I'm thinking of the sort of the callousness of people who would use other people to further their own argument. And then I'm also thinking of the parents whose children are born with a DSD condition. And then those people themselves, that they are the real victims here. And I mean, what do they feel about this? And what is it like? What is it? What's the experience like for those people of living with a disorder of sex development?
So I'm not a clinician, I'm not a medic. I don't directly face patients within this domain, but I have worked in clinical genetics and I do face patients and have faced patients with other types of medical conditions. I think as women, we have an intuitive understanding that being born and being recorded as a girl, a baby girl, midwife, doctor, your mum, whoever is there saying it's a girl, and then experiencing childhood as a girl, and then entering puberty and your progression through puberty, not going through that typical trajectory. I can't imagine. It must be appalling. It must be confusing. It would have been confusing for me with a lot of medical resources at my fingertips and a mum who I could speak to and a GP who I could go and see with any issue. If you are a girl who is less fortunate than I, growing up somewhere where you don't have that access to education, medical facilities, and maybe where culturally you're not allowed to even start talking about this, it's really, really hard. I have huge amounts of empathy for girls who realize that there's something atypical about their bodies. Maybe that covers a lot of other things, as you know, alongside DSDs.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
then
we're acutely aware, aren't we, as young women, on about ourselves and our own development. We want to be like everyone else, and we always feel that we're not. And it must be a terrible thing to have to go through. And all your plans for the future presumably are in abeyance. That must be really, really difficult.
yeah,
Uh,
it's important to, you know, I get told off, if you like, for thinking about things like sexual function and reproductive future. I mean,
yeah,
most girls and then women think that they're going to have babies.
yes, yeah,
This is not unusual,
no,
and a lot of women feel very strongly that they want babies.
yeah,
And to understand that there's something about your body that doesn't let that happen
yeah,
is a blow. It's a blow for any infertile female and probably any infertile male as well.
yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, yeah. I get, as Bex was saying, I get very cross about people claiming to be intersex, and you think, well, is this true? Is this, are some people just taking this on almost as a pretense?
So there was a paper, I call it a paper, I'm doing audio quote marks around that. A paper some 30 years ago from a guy in the States, in America, who framed the idea of being trans. So, feeling like you want to present as the opposite sex and whatever steps you take to do that. He framed being trans as being intersex, as was the language at the time. Because his argument was, if your brain doesn't match your body, then definitionally that's intersex. And intersex at that time was being used. We don't use that language, but it was being used to describe medical conditions. And it is the linchpin, it is the single hook that gender identity ideology needs, because it is the single hook that they use to destroy concepts of sex.
Yeah,
So watching trans people or trans allies or advocates use people with medical conditions is
yeah,
really awful. There was a brilliant but really, really devastating parody, and it's going to sound awful when I say it was a parody. So, sex is a spectrum, as they say, audio quotes there. Sex is a spectrum, and someone parodied that as cancer as a spectrum.
wow,
And everyone was rightly
yeah,
outraged.
yeah,
This, how dare you use a medical condition to
yeah,
make a political point? But it was very effective because it is the same thing. How
yeah,
dare you use a medical condition,
yeah,
argue for your politics,
yeah,
politics, make the point.
yeah,
We'll deal with that as it is. But
yeah.
can we stop using people with medical conditions
Mm,
to, exploit? They're being
yeah.
exploited.
What I'm often struck with, when you see journalists interviewing about the cases that we've seen of the sports people with possible DSDs, is the lack of research. So as soon as somebody makes a claim about the DSD, it's completely believed. Do you think there's a case for sort of better information going through to our journalists? Is that something that's needed?
So I think it is a really confusing domain for journalists who typically aren't biologists, okay, to try and grasp. And particularly since for 60 or so years, people have been told, here are most people are male, here are most people are female, and in the middle, the intersex cohort are some group of people that you can't possibly understand, nor can you predict anything about them. So I don't really blame journalists for not understanding. I guess most of them don't have biology PhDs. What's mostly interesting is that when I might, contact a journalist and say, hello, I can tell you what this DSD that this athlete has means for something like sport. A surprising number just turn back to me and say, oh, you're just a bigot, we're not going to talk to you. Because I'm saying, for example, that Imane Khalif is male, and that's dangerous in a boxing ring. We're not going to talk to you because you won't use female pronouns or whatever that means. And they don't want to learn. The BBC are particularly bad at this.
No.
There are some notable exceptions. Oliver Brown at the Telegraph has been exceptional on his reporting. Many are talking to me and others, I assume, but they don't report on it. And there is a mass propaganda kind of push to say that for reasons, about dignity, that these athletes are female, they're women, and you cannot question that. Hang on, we're talking about sports categorization in this case.
Yeah.
And we do question that. We question categorization in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
We don't have to think about toilets at this point. We don't have to think about sexuality at this point or anything. We're literally just talking about what is this body? This is a person with a body, but what is this body and what does that mean in sport?
For those of us that don't have a PhD in developmental science, developmental biology, I can't even remember what it's called. What's a DSD? How, what is it? And is it as simple as somebody with a DSD is always definitely male or definitely female?
So disorder of sex development is when your typical predicted development to being, a functional reproductively healthy female or a functional reproductively healthy male has been altered in some way. We're not really thinking about infertility. That happens for an awful lot of other reasons. We're talking about development. We're talking about what your anatomy looks like, how that works, how that interacts with your hormones. So if you are female, that means for the most part, you've got XX chromosomes. When you're developing in the womb, you start developing ovaries. And after that event, you're going to start developing a uterus and a cervix and a vagina and a vulva. If you have a mutation, a change in a gene that you need to make a vulva, for example, or if you have a change in your hormones that mean you can't support that genetic information, say make a vulva, then maybe you don't make a typical vulva. And that would be observed as that's a bit atypical, and in Western medicine investigated. And the same is true for male. Okay, males typically have XY chromosomes and testicles and a penis. But sometimes things are, you have mutations, you have environmental issues, mostly genetic though, to be fair, where you can't, for example, grow a typical penis. So when you're born, you don't have a typical penis. Even though you're male, you've just, you've got a kind of break in the chain of your development and you don't grow a typical penis. And that might mean in some very extreme cases that people write you down as female. And that doesn't stop you being male. It just means you're a male with a mutation or some kind of interruption in your normal development. So those are the kinds of things that we think about with DSDs. What's a typical development trajectory, and where can the differences make an effect, particularly in how we record your sex at birth, which is based on what your external genitals look like. And sometimes that can be incredibly misleading. Some males can be born with very, very, unquestionably female external genitals, and so they are recorded as female. This is medicine, this is biology, this is development.
Yeah.
What stuff happens.
And are those particular conditions? I mean, I was looking at a sort of list of DSD type conditions. It seemed that there were more associated with being male. Is that true?
In developmental biology, growing, developing as a female is a reasonably, I'm going to say this for lay people, it's a reasonably straightforward process.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to branch out to being a male,
yes,
you have to turn on a lot of genes. You have to start making a lot of hormones that aren't usually there in an embryo that is developing happily as female. So when you have to do a lot of actions, when you have to turn on genes, when you have to turn on hormones, there's a lot more things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
So there are about 50 or so recognized DSDs. They're very well categorized. They have genes associated with them. We understand the altered trajectory from normal, healthy male or female development. But an awful lot more of them affect males. And that's because you have to do something really active to make a male. And so there's a lot more points at which that process can go wrong.
See, that makes perfect sense. And I suppose that fits in as well with the fact that in some ways women are the stronger sex, more of us survive pregnancy, more of us, we live longer, all of those things. You're smiling, you like that?
Well, I think that there's a whole argument within evolutionary biology, which is, why do we need males? And the outcome seems to be, well, they provide some genetic diversity. So they're, delivering sperm. We're not just cloning ourselves. Females aren't just cloning themselves. And so males provide a different set of DNA that is good for, the population generally.
Yeah.
But really, female is the blueprint.
Yeah.
It's the template. And there are some female animals, like species that used to be female and male populations, and they've just chucked out the males, right? They've learned a way to clone themselves in a way that doesn't affect their sensitivity to environmental changes and, the robustness of how they just survive as a species. But really, all males do in humans is provide a little package of DNA. And that's just...
Sure, they wouldn't put it like that.
I mean, they might do. But so if females can provide that genetic robustness in the absence of males, we would default to that. We would definitely default to that. We're much more reliable a producer of, the next generation.
Interesting. So 5-ARD, 5-alpha reductase deficiency. This is potentially the condition that the two boxers, Iman Khalif and Lin Tu-Young, have. What do we know about that?
We're talking now about a particular disorder of sex development called 5-ALD. Yes, you're right, 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So this is a DSD that affects males. And 5-alpha reductase is an enzyme. So it's a protein that does a job. And deficiency means you don't have it. So, it's a protein and enzyme that's encoded by a gene, and you've got a mutation in that gene that means you don't make a functional enzyme. That enzyme is required to, I'm going to put it bluntly, grow a penis. So you can be a perfectly typical male developing in the womb, male, male, male. You've got testes, they're going to become testicles. You're growing, all the internal male plumbing that females don't have, and you're not growing a uterus or a cervix or a vagina. So you're developing happily as a male. And then what happens with 5-alpha reductase deficiency, 5-ALD, is that you lack the enzyme that needs to complete that final step, which is the growing of a penis. And so you don't grow a typical penis. That maybe means some different things in society. We can, what that means on your birth certificate. Maybe you look more like a female than a male when you're born. But in sport, that means something very, very different, because we don't play sports with our external genitals. It doesn't matter whether you've got a penis or a vulva for how you play sport. What matters in sport is all of that internal biology, all of your testes or ovaries, the hormones they're making, and how that affects your muscles and not your penis. So I always make this, it's very social media. If you took Usain Bolt and chopped off his penis, he wouldn't run any slower, because he doesn't need, I don't think he needs his penis to run. And so there's this tension between understanding what anatomy looks like versus what physiology looks like, versus what your muscles and your cardiovascular system, all of these non-reproductive things, all of these tissues that respond to testosterone that people with 5-ARD have, and what that means for sports. So Caster Semenya has 5-ARD. Caster Semenya may or may not have looked, whatever Caster Semenya looked like at birth is none of my business. I know Caster Semenya has 5-ARD, and that is my business, because that means something for sport. Because what it means is Caster Semenya is XY, testes, testosterone, and Caster Semenya's muscles respond to testosterone just like any other male.
I think you told me once before that in Spanish there is a name for this.
5-ARD is clustered in the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are running more and more genetic testing around the world, just as a product of medical science, but it was kind of first clustered in the Dominican Republic. And in Spanish, which is spoken in the Dominican Republic, it's called hueve doce. So eggs at 12.
Right.
And there's some irony, because it's eggs at 12, but the eggs mean testicles,
Right.
not eggs.
Yeah.
But what that means is that these are, it's a small population. There are a lot of genetic diseases in small populations. But what this means is that people, girls, audio quotes there, girls observed who at puberty masculinized. They didn't have enough, because of this missing enzyme, they didn't have enough of a testosterone derivative to masculinize in the womb, but at puberty they catch up, and so they get their testicles at 12.
Right.
And over 50% of males, they are male, with this disorder, even if they were registered as female at birth, transition their identity, whatever that means, they change their legal status and they change their social identity to be male. You can't run away from puberty.
No.
Right?
I mean, that must be so traumatic for a 12-year-old.
Although I think in these small communities, it's almost achieved a bit of a mythical kind of status, right?
Yeah.
But these males go on to father children with their sperm, not in any weird way, just the normal male way of fathering children with sperm.
Yeah.
And for me, that's always been a situation where biology does, reign supreme.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
if you're male, and you might,
That surge of testosterone is so powerful, isn't it?
you can't run away from it unless you're a male in a female category, and then you might be able to run away.
And is there any evidence that these young people are sought out as athletes?
So there is, I mean, I'm engaged, enmeshed, I suppose, in the darkest corners of sports. Maybe not as dark as Lance Armstrong, but still sports is not always a noble venture. Back in the, post-war period, countries used sports as a way of, rectifying their global reputation, and doping now is used as a way of dominating, or sports washing. We call it sports washing. It's a political tool, and winning gold medals in an Olympics is not unusual for us in the UK or in the States. It is really unusual for certain countries. Many countries have never won a gold medal. Somewhere like Namibia, where two gold medals, two athletes who are suddenly burst into the international stage and start winning, that means a lot of money for Namibia, right? I mean, let's not pretend that's a lot of global recognition. But for a country like Namibia, 3 years ago, produced two athletes with 5 ARD. So this DSD where you are male but you don't grow a penis, and therefore you might be misclassified as female at birth. That's really unusual. So scouting for, and I'm doing audio quotes here, girls that run like boys does happen. It's known, it's going to bring you money, it's going to bring you international recognition. And that's important. I'm not going to argue about the politics of that sport. Like I say, it's drawn into those international politics. But let's not pretend that this is all, a noble vocational thing. And certainly not for the federations that run countries might want to have an Olympic gold medalist.
Yeah, you can understand that.
So I think what's interesting with sport at the moment is we've sort of got into this tangled web, which we've discussed a little bit so far, where the discourse around trans inclusion and the discourse around how people with DSDs are included have been grouped in together. We've ended up in a situation where people feel that you're bigoted for, having what would normally be a very sort of standard, unexpectable discussion around how someone like Imane Khalif or how someone like Caster Semenya should be able to compete. What impact is that having on fairness in sport?
Looping back, I think, a little bit to what we spoke about earlier, and the often unwanted inclusion of people with medical conditions into gender identity ideology, that we and I, back in 2020, and many others since, have made the argument that transgender athletes, so males who think they're women and want to be women and maybe suppress their hormones and whatever, want to be in female sport, that was retrospectively, that feels like a very easy argument to make against. And indeed, almost all sports federations are turning over to the idea that if you are male and you've been through male development, and that starts in the womb, we can see sports differences pre-puberty, not just post-puberty, but pre-puberty, then that means you can't be in the female category. But sure enough, they loop around back to, but what about, this apparent woman who has been banned because of this or deemed ineligible because of this. And so still we're using people with medical conditions, and they are complicated in sport. It's not as easy as saying, look, you were born a boy, you've been through male development, and when you're 40, you decide to suppress testosterone. Frankly, that's not getting you into the female category. People with DSDs aren't that. They're not that same cohort, but they are used in the same way. And to some extent, the biology is quite simple, actually. I've just described the biology of a trans-identified male, which is you were born male, you experience male development, and that's relevant for sport. For a lot of DSDs, you were born looking female, but you are in fact male. You've experienced male development, and that makes you ineligible for female sport. So the biology is very similar. The social angles are deeply different in terms of how much sympathy I feel for the two different cohorts.
Yeah, let's unpick them from each other then, the two different cohorts. So let's start with people with DSDs. Are there safe and fair ways to include them in sports? Does it have to be case by case or condition by condition? What would you say?
So my framework for understanding DSDs in sport is coincidental, not following, but coincidental with other people who have developed similar frameworks, which is condition by condition. So it's not case by case. You can't for any sport do case by case. What are you going to say? Like, here's a heavyweight boxer, but he's a really rubbish puncher, so we'll just let him in with the lightweights. Case by case makes no sense in any category determination. Condition by condition, and I don't want to say that being female is a condition or being male is a condition, but thinking scientifically is a condition type scenario. Condition by condition, what do we understand? Okay, some people are XY, right? And usually most people who are XY are male, right? Just unambiguously male. But some people who are XY have DSDs, which means they're not unambiguously male. It means sometimes they look female at birth. It means sometimes their testosterone doesn't work. It means sometimes they can't respond to that testosterone. Being XY, having testicles, not ovaries, because that's where all your testosterone is going to come from, starts to look like a pattern, right? It's the pattern that's associated with being male. But if you can't respond to that testosterone in sport, I'm not going to argue about any other social context or whatever, but in sport, if you can't respond to the huge amount of testosterone that your testes might be putting out, you're probably similarly situated to someone like me, who is a very typical female, right? I mean, maybe you even have lower testosterone response to me because females have testosterone. So trying to understand condition by condition, what's your genetics? What's your hormones? How do you respond to those hormones? And what do we know that means for your male typical development? Maybe some of it looks a bit more female. But what does that mean for male development in terms of your muscles, your height, your cardiovascular capacity? And what does that mean for sport? So it has to be condition by condition, because we can't have a situation where you're just saying, well, you've got this medical condition, but you're all right. And you've got the same medical condition, but you're a bit bulky. Because we don't say that for women. We don't say that for men. We shouldn't be. We're not in the realms of challenging women rugby players for saying, oh, you're a bit muscular. Jesus, sport is supposed to be about celebrating all those wonderful things about women who are, gender non-conforming.
I think that's a really interesting point that you raise, because this is another argument that you often see. You see, there are differences in sport, there are advantages. Some people have longer legs and they're taller. Should they be banned as well? You often see that sort of disingenuous type of argument being put out. I suppose now we're moving away from strictly discussions around DSDs and more back towards trans inclusion in women's sports. I mean, how can we respond to that argument?
So my response to the argument about this is that a lot of people don't understand categories. They think they're just kind of convenience ideas. Oh, we'll just put the men in one side and the women in another. We'll just put the big fellas in boxing and the light ones in another space. But categories are a really, really important concept in sport, and they are a very disputed concept in sport. Categories serve a function. They wouldn't exist, and we would argue against them if they didn't serve a function, right? They're utilitarian, and that's to pit people who have the same types of physiological advantages against other people that have the same types, the same pattern of physiological advantages against each other, and not against people that don't have that. So if you're a male, you don't box against a female. If you're a heavyweight, you don't box against a lightweight. If you are able-bodied, you don't box against a Paralympian. If you're 60, you don't box against a 25-year-old, because we recognize baseline physiological differences. And lots of people, I've spent a ton of time thinking of this. I'm a developmental biologist, but I work with philosophers who really invest a lot of time into understanding why do we have categories? What do categories look like? What's the necessary, sufficient, boundaries of a category? And lots of people that I talk to don't understand that. They think they're just almost, like I say, convenience kind of things. Oh, you turn out and you're like a woman, so we're going to put you in this category. Actually, they do mean something, and they do mean something very specifically. They're creating fair competition. And women can't have fair competition when they're competing against men. And that's, most people don't even question that. People understand that there are male and female categories. What they really skew about is, what does that category boundary look like? It's very easy for weight categories. Oh, it's a 66 kilogram weight category. If you're under it, you can be in it. If you're over it, you can't be in it. That's a hard line. The male-female boundary is a hard line as well. But we have this kind of social idea that, well, some people weren't born like this, or some people feel differently about themselves. Sports doesn't need to pay attention to that. Sports is supposed to be ignoring that, right? We're all diverse, but biology matters.
That's a really, really good way of putting it. I think it's one of these things, isn't it, where somebody may have a physical advantage in terms of, this woman's taller than that woman, but the other may have a technique advantage, and you could be the tallest woman in the world and the worst runner. It's very different.
So there's a really brilliant example that I use in swimming, which is Michael Phelps. Now, Michael Phelps is my bête noire, right? Oh, what about Michael Phelps? He's so talented that nobody could beat him. And I'm like, so what, right? We celebrate athletes that are really, really talented so that they're dominant. Now, Michael Phelps is this, kind of very swimming, very tall, very broad-shouldered, the perfect wingspan, his arm length to his height. He had some metabolic advantages. His feet are basically like dolphins or something. Do dolphins have feet? They don't, do they? But you know what I mean, right? So he's basically got flippers for feet and all this kind of nonsense that people say about Michael Phelps. Now, Michael Phelps was an amazing swimmer. His world records are now breaking. And they're breaking, and almost all of Phelps's records are gone now. And there's one guy that's taking a lot of Michael Phelps's records. And he's not as tall. He's not as I said this to a group of swimmers and they laughed at me, but I said he's not as a perfect physique as a swimmer, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, he's the most pet." It's like, hang on, but he's not as tall. He doesn't have as wide a wingspan. He doesn't have flippers for feet. His bones aren't made of adamantium or whatever. What he does have is a really mental start, right? So when he jumps off, is it called the blocks in swimming? I forget. But when he jumps off that, he does some insane thing and he lands in the water 20 meters ahead of anyone else, right? And that gives him a head start. And that's amazing. That's like Michael Phelps, who was built for swimming, and Caleb Dressel, who has just gone, I'm not as perfectly built for swimming as Michael Phelps, but look at what I can do. Those are the differential advantages that we celebrate in sport. We love them. We look at Caleb Dressel and go, oh my goodness, dude, what have you just done there? Where is your hip going? Where is your rear leg working? These are amazing. We celebrate natural advantage within categories. We don't, and we can't celebrate males in female categories because that's a categorical boundary.
I suspect I know the answer to this, and I suspect most people do, but just for the sake of clarity, when we're focusing on the issue of trans inclusion into opposite sex sports, is there any course of hormones or any treatment or anything in the world that they can do that is going to negate the advantages given by being a natal male, going through male puberty?
So if we think about what might look like fair inclusion, if we think about, for example, a male who might be able to undertake some kind of hormonal regime. I'm a developmental biologist. I think about changing people's genetics, right? But let's just say there might be something you could do to a male person, a male fetus, early enough in development that would negate the male advantage that they will accrue over their lifetime. From my point of view, scientifically, that might say it's fair. Other people might disagree, but it might say it's, at least at the physiological level, fair. I don't think that's where the argument ends. From my point of view, that's where the argument starts. Because frankly, the least anyone can do is say, this is a treatment that at least makes something physiologically equal. And then we can argue, we can talk, we can discuss about whether females actually, need this space in given sports and what's important to, and it is really important to have female only spaces, even regardless, right? But the least you can do is try and make it fair. But the actual position in science now is nobody's anywhere near even making it fair. So it's a bit of a kicking the can down the road, right? But we're not there anyway, because you can't undo male development. We're not gonna genetically alter male babies in the womb in the idea that at 35 they're going to suddenly think that they're women and change their hormones. This is dystopian science fiction. So we're not going to be able to make it fair. Male development is a lifelong process. It starts at 6 weeks and it never ends. So I don't see a treatment, whatever that looks like, that can negate that. When you propose one, then we'll start talking again.
Gosh, I think I could carry on talking about this. I mean, there are so many things, from the scandal in East Germany following the war, where female athletes were sort of being given hormones and the impact that that's had on them, not just in sporting competitions, but throughout their life. I think that's really fascinating, the point you make, that fairness is the starting point. So what are the real advantages or the real sort of physiological benefits that males are going to have over females. So I've heard things like they have a larger lung capacity or to do with blood circulation. What are some of the key advantages that particularly affect sport participation?
So male development, and by that I'm talking about an embryo, tiny little that's male, is receiving testosterone signals from that point, right? So testosterone signals in the womb that say make male anatomy, testosterone signals post-birth that say it's a kind of weird thing for non-biologists to think of, but in future you're going to be male, so we're going to like prime you to be male. We're going to imprint your genes in a particular way that you're going to be male, and then at puberty more testosterone that says now grow. And what male development does is, along a life course, create greater height, create wider shoulders and narrower hips, create bigger muscle mass, bigger lung volume, bigger heart volume. This is not all just about size, it's also about function. So within a muscle, there are little like energy cells that say make your muscle work well. And the metabolic rate of male muscle is different to the metabolic rate of female muscle. The way nerves feed into muscles and say move, move, move is different in males and females. The entire of male biology is designed to move fast, produce a lot of force, and fundamentally, in an evolutionary sense, fight off other males or, lions that are coming into your household, right? So males are built for physicality, females are built in another way for nurturing and we have females have their own skills. Don't get me wrong. We have much better vision than men. But men are built around. Well, actually, it's the other way around. Patriarchy has built sport, and males are better at sport. Kelsey Priest.
So, in effect, what you're saying is it's not all about puberty, although puberty does have a huge impact on advantage, because we do often see this argument around, well, what if they've taken puberty blockers? But you're saying right from embryonic stage, there's differences there, and even prepubescent children, there's differences there. So puberty blockers do not negate.
Yeah, so if you look in utero, so in the womb, about how male and female babies are growing, there are different growth charts for tiny embryonic boys and girls. And in utero, boys have bigger heads. They've always had bigger heads, but they have like thicker vertebrae. They have longer head to bottom distances, meaning they're taller. They have different fat distributions. They have different placental interactions. The placenta is how a baby interacts with mum, who is female. But they have different interactions. Baby boys in the womb, baby boys take more nutrients from mum, and they grow bigger and harder than baby girls. I mean, these are small differences in the womb, but they're meaningful. And then when they're born, they're longer, they're heavier, they have bigger heads still. And through childhood, all of this is maintained. And when you look at sports performance, actually, in childhood, boys throw more, they throw longer, they're stronger, they can do pull-ups and push-ups more than better or more effectively than girls can. And not all of this is just the socialization of let's chuck boys up trees and girls are told to sew. There are some of the differences are huge, even in childhood. The way a young boy can throw a ball is like 60% greater than the way a young girl can throw a ball. You can't teach that. That's just physical differences between young males and young females. So there is a lot of differences, and it is lifelong. We're just a species that has males and females, and it does us well to start that early.
Wow, Emma, I mean, this has been so fascinating. I suppose we sort of come to the end now. And our final question, which is, do you have a woman of the moment?
I have lots of women at the moment, I suppose, and that's a good thing, because we are kind of really on a momentum drive. I've said this for 10 years now. This is the thing. This is the thing. This is the thing that will generate momentum. And we can all think about flagship kind of events, when J.K. Rowling, entered the room. Where I think we're all in a state now where I'm going to have to say there are 3 women of the moment, and they are Marion, Susan, and Trina for Women Scotland, because they have changed the face of the legal landscape. And that feeds into an awful lot of what we're talking about here, but also just generally for women. And I don't see how anyone could say any different at this point. They have won such a victory, and they've made it clear what being a woman means and what that means in sport, but also in life. And I think that's what a lot of us have been fighting for a long time. So Marion, Susan, and Trina.
What incredible women. Yeah. Perfect pick. Thank you to Emma for speaking to us today. And thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.